Our next session is panel session 3, which will be chaired by Dr. Leslie Hitch, who will introduce you to the panellists, but let me first introduce her. Dr. Hitch is a Senior Faculty Fellow for the School of Education and Higher Education Administration Faculty Lead at Northeastern University. She's a visiting professor at Swinburne University, and Leslie designs and teaches online and traditional courses in higher education administration and in adult and organisational learning. Thank you, Leslie.
Thanks, Joanne, and I think that it is appropriate that we're on next after listening to Kodak, and what Rowan doesn't know is that years ago I was at Polaroid when we went through a similar situation. You probably never even heard of the place before. It reminded me of a story, and those of you in the audience, I'm proud to say, are many of the students that I've been privileged to teach. This is my 5th time in Melbourne. When I arrive here and I send a note back to Boston saying, I'm here, I get notes back from my family that says, welcome home. I adore the city, I adore Swinburne, and I adore teaching the Global Leadership Program. So my students know that my great love is actually history. And what the story that Rowan told and some of the way that we're going to go about today in this panel reminds me of a book by David McCullough of the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. And I'm sure if you've not seen it in person, you've seen pictures of it. It's big. It's really big. And the story that he tells is as they were putting in the struts for this huge, huge bridge that was for the first time going to connect Manhattan Island to Brooklyn, where the only way that you could go back and forth prior to that was via the water. So this entire monolith of a bridge is going up, and during that time, the ferry company, which was based literally underneath the bridge, is refurbishing its waiting room. It's very hard for people to see clear and present danger when you can't really see clear and present danger. Those of us who are teaching in the leadership program and the panelists that you're going to hear now are spending our careers trying to get people, as Richard said this morning, to come forth with a different kind of a mindset. So you're not here to hear me, I'm here to help facilitate. So I want to briefly introduce in the same way that John did, John Fain did this morning by saying you can read their bios in the back of the little booklet, but just one little line on each. Dougal Edwards, I've been referring to, people say, who's on your panel? I said, I think he's a serial entrepreneur. So don't be afraid of him, but he's a serial entrepreneur. Greg Harper is going to give us the business perspective. He works with talent within companies, the people who are going to need to not have that kind of mindset that the Kodak executives had. And there's one more line on Nita Cherry, who is a colleague from Swinburne, that is missing from her biography, and that she is about to publish her new book on energizing leadership. So with that, I want to thank the panelists in advance, and there will be some questions. We are going to start with Greg and take it from there.
Just thank you, John, for inviting me to participate in the first Global Leadership Conference. It's been a wonderful day. There's a great range of perspectives and lots of different light bulb moments for me. Certainly seeing all the positive work that's being done across the whole range of activities in leadership development and leadership more generally. We've talked big picture, haven't we, this morning about our challenges with global warming or climate change, sustainability, and they certainly are a context for, highlighting the imperative of leadership. My perspective is going to be a lot more focused at much closer to ground level, and that's working with organisations. And I'll come at it from a couple of perspectives. Firstly, I suppose as a person who works with organisations and organisational development programs, putting them together with the organisations, co-creating them with those organisations, and also as an executive. I've been a CEO of a couple of organisations, and I've been a senior executive in government, and been through a lot of change. Recently with a lot of change in the university, actually, with TAFE. But before that, I did that, I just wanted to digress a little bit. I started life, actually, as my first qualification was in environmental science. And I've always been quite passionate about sustainability and environmental science. I ride my bike to my train station in the morning, things like this. So, how do you sort of survive in a corporate world? Well, most people have got their own passions and their own reasons for doing things, and I've certainly found mine in helping people develop. But before I go into that story a little bit, I just wanted to reflect, if you might indulge me for a second, on some of the content of that big picture stuff this morning. I've had, since 1976, when I started looking at environmental science, and the first horror story was, global warming and environmental science. As a young environmental science student, I first thought, oh my God, how challenging is that? The big challenge then was DDT, which they fixed, and holes in the ozone and so on. And probably until fairly recently, I've been fairly despondent because globally we seem to have been unable to pull it together. But there's a program on Four Corners that only a few weeks ago now that gave me a lot of hope, because it highlighted the technical solutions that are coming through and the market that's driving that sort of change. And my sense is we can actually consume less and grow. And that is something that I think gives us hope that we can actually, through expanding capability and services like education, grow the economy, because the service economy is the fastest growing section of the economy, and it's not necessarily consuming more resources. So it's wrong to think of growth as being just about consumption. It's not. It's about better services to people. So our game's a service industry, and in that sector, I just wanted to quickly reflect on a couple of the developments that are happening currently. What are the things that are really driving organisational priorities in development, particularly leadership development? And then just conclude with a couple of comments about where that might be taking us. The first thing that's the most common frame for organisational development is an approach, a model really, which they call 70-20-10. Now, those of you who are in organisational development roles can sort of turn off for a minute and look at Facebook or whatever. But it's based on the idea that most learning in the workplace, 70% of it, most leadership learning happens from experience, from what you've done on the job, from challenges that you've had to deal with. 20% from learning from others, from mentoring and coaching and advice and feedback that you might get in the workplace from your colleagues, and just 10% from structured learning, and that includes online learning, purposeful learning, or even reading books. And a lot of organisations have taken this, and in fact the group that really commercialised it was Eisinger and Lombardo from Centre for Creative Leadership, and they've made a business out of it. But what it means, what it's translated into, is organisations look to turn it around the other way. Their structured programs have a big focus on leveraging that 10%, give people foundations, support it with coaching and mentoring in the workplace, and then make sure that there's really strong applied projects, work-based projects. And many of the big companies, and we'd be working with probably 70 or 80 companies at the moment, and organisations, a lot of government organisations, are focusing on that. The second big driver is part of that, and that's the coaching piece, but it's also more broadly about the emotional intelligence agenda. And that links in with interestingly, to authenticity, compassion, and that whole mindset concept, which are threaded through Richard's book in various different ways. Coaching is very popular in organisations, but I think it's really only starting. A lot of organisational leadership programs have focused on what you might call strategy or IQ, right? The EQ side of it, the people side of it, the relationship side of it, actually is quite challenging. It's the most difficult for a lot of people, and it's often technically what people are least prepared for. So we get a lot of IT professionals and engineers that have got to where they are because they're good technically, but not good at the people stuff, and they get put into management roles and they're ill-prepared for having challenging conversations with people, knowing how to develop people. So that's where coaching comes in. It's a very effective technique for developing people, and it's a bit of counterintuitive for people whose skills have been about telling, about doing, about strategy. It's actually sitting back, asking questions, giving people the opportunity to develop, giving people the opportunity to try things and fail, and rather than jumping in and fixing it for them. And it does require a lot of development in order to shift that mindset to that developmental mindset, that you're not there to provide the answers, that you're there to help people, to enable people to develop the solutions for themselves. And that's what builds capability in organisations. That's where organisations are today, and most leading organisations are today, building that sort of capability. Interestingly though, there's a lot of organisations who've got old-style command and control cultures, who have built these sort of cultures. And I had an experience with one of my clients the other day, and she was bemoaning the fact that they've built this wonderful culture and they've been taken over by an overseas company that is very command and control, very immature culture, very untrusting. And you're getting that sort of dynamic shifting quite a lot. And some are saying, in fact, if anything, with globalisation, it's culturally dragged a lot of organisational change backwards. What we are seeing is, though, in the Occidental perspective, in our perspective, domestic Australia, a big emphasis on EQ, as I mentioned. And the thing I've noticed about it, and I've been a bit of research in this, is the organisations that are most interested in EQ, and Swinburne University developed a very good instrument for measuring emotional intelligence called GENOS, which is floated off as a business. It's global, big in the United States, about to do a big deal in Europe. That tool basically is used as a catalyst for people to become more emotionally self-aware and understand how they perceive by their peers. That's how it's used. So it's then used in coaching conversations and so on. Organisations that tend to use that, there's a lot of public sector organisations, a lot of organisations which I would say have more feminised workforces. And I would say, I'd go further, I suspect that it's associated with the increasing feminisation of leadership roles in organisations. So I see it as a positive thing. I see it as a very, it's a thing that's got a trend that has got a long way to play, and it's because it's a capability that is quite critical to bringing about the sort of changes that organisations need. And that dealing with change, that challenge of meeting the agenda of change is not something that's it's new, it's an old thing. It won't go away. It's been there since Niccolo Machiavelli spoke about it in these terms. There is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of the new order of things. It's just that this is happening much more quickly these days. Thanks.
Thank you.
Sad seeing companies that have died. There we go. It's like borders and... so, hi everyone. I think I'm up here because I represent a minority that's growing out there and somewhat responsible for some of these larger companies going the way they do. I have two roles in life. One is to disrupt and one is to help others find a way to redisrupt their own organizations. So I'm coming to you from a position where I've been able to, thanks to John, be able to reflect back on why I do what I do. And I was recently asked in a public forum, as entrepreneurs tend to, because we're a strange bunch. People like to understand why we do what we do and what our view is on things, and we're not really any wiser than anyone else. It's just the fact that we're in the trenches a bit more. I was recently asked to share my opinion on the collision of culture and technology, the impact that technology is having on culture here and globally. And my response was one that was somewhat flippant at the time, but it's given me some time to think since, that there would be no culture without technology. Technology has been and always will be a part of everything we do. Technology is the wheel, the fire, the printing press, the car, the telegram, the internet, the iPhone, and the app that sits on the iPhone. Even letters formed into words are technology. The way our eyes translate that into electrical pulses into our brain and form images is pretty special. It's always been with us. Technology cements society together and allows it to function, to share skills and time between people. My favorite definition of culture is one that's very simple by Brian Eno, which is culture is everything that we don't have to do. It's what took us out of the caves and put tools in our hands and enabled us to share. Do I need? Okay. I sometimes get passionate and I don't want to headbutt there we go. And share responses and build communities. However, what I believe was the weak signal in the sentiment behind this question is the fear that's been created only by those that have identified the adverse impacts on society, and was this belief that technology is somehow discrete from culture. And I was wondering, why is this such a source of anxiety now? Well, there are two dramatic shifts that technology has been behind: health and communication. In the last 100 years alone, life expectancy has soared, infant mortality has plummeted, and this has more than quadrupled the population on the planet. Interconnectivity has exploded from the train, the motor car, the aeroplane, to telegrams, telephone, and the internet. It's this omnipresent presence of technology that has made this world that is so much more crowded feel a whole lot more crowded. It's this inescapable background static from a global village, the noise, physical, virtual, and emotional, that left unfiltered is this race to the bottom that people feel is the reality that we face today. So with change, uncertainty, transition, transformation. We see this as a fear of technology, but it's not technology. This is the culture, the society. Technology is just an enabler. I feel like I'm defending technology. It's true. Think about it. Anyway, this is the old world living in the new world. It's the world where we're already living multiple future realities. These different realities are all fueled by technology, and one of those, or many of those future realities will come to be. The future is here, but it's just not evenly distributed. That's not my quote. I don't know who that is, but it really does sum up where we are today. However, the fear is that I see that this shift between the old and new is the fear that this dystopian future that we have portrayed in so many films is inevitable. This is not the case. You see, technology itself is the benign villain and the mad scientist, so to speak. To date, that has been left unchecked. It's the mastermind in that system that blindly believes that growth is the be-all of everything. Some might call that mastermind capitalism, but that's a conversation for another day. I'd like to borrow from an essay by Einstein back in 1946. He summed it up as, our world faces a crisis yet unperceived by those possessing power to make great decisions for good or evil. The unleashed power of technology has changed everything save our mode of thinking, and we thus drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. This has been summarized in a wrongly attributed quote to him that was, "It has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity." Now the question is, if leaders acknowledge this and recognize that they have a choice and want to back a desirable future, how do they identify which future, and how do they pick? What I have done through my work, and I recognize through I advise leadership boards, I advise leaders on technology and the way that it's taken us forward, is that there's a gap in leadership in our societies today. It's because of our lack of understanding at a cultural level of technology's role in creating society. It has up until now sat in our collective blind spot. This is a gap that has been there since the Industrial Revolution, but only recently as technology is being used by society to create an unsustainable present, where we are using 1.5 times our Earth's resources just to sustain our current levels of consumption. Only now has it become meaningful, visible, and pivotal to society. Up until now, we have allowed technology to be developed and applied at the hands of the unconscious, or that entity that historically has not had to have a conscience or awareness, the corporation. And in the absence of an alternative, we have allowed the corporation to assume the role of leader in the evolution and the uses of technology, and by default, therefore, the leaders of the evolution of our society. Mindlessly capitalizing on the efficiencies offered by technology, propelling us on towards the next disruption, all in the quest of an unending and unsustainable growth. And today we're feeling both the good and the bad applications of technology and the global impact. And presently we can see and feel the negative actions in this time of change. We must understand, for balance to be restored, it's our responsibility to recognize that to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. We must recognize that the leadership gap in society today needs our support. My work's shown to me, really, that we have a lack of authentic leadership that deeply understands technology, its capability, its implications, and its possible applications for good and for harm. The mistake we make today is that we believe that the old world leadership can use old world models of control to bring us back into balance. And to complicate this further, this old world leadership now includes corporations with GDPs larger than some affluent countries. Further, this old world believes it benefits from the old world paradigms. And this old world believes somehow that this old world can be returned to. The mistake these leaders of the old world make is that they believe they can use control of technology to stop the bad or disruptive things, and that we will somehow reverse what they have unleashed. To attempt to restrict disruptive technology, as I know from firsthand from a number of businesses that I've been involved in, once it's out there, it already exists and lives. It's too late and the genie is out of the bottle. When something is useful, something as useful as a disruptive technology that society has adopted is removed or constrained within society, it leaves a vacuum, and that vacuum will be filled by an equivalently disruptive influence. Instead, as a society, we must act, for when we don't act, we react. There is a huge difference between leaders and those who lead. It is these individuals who act, some of whom may be the leaders in the traditional sense, for we need more of those to become aware. It's also those leaders in society, the connectors of influence, these leaders that must shift from a stance of control and restriction to one of conscious guidance from a position of understanding. This requires authentic leadership to develop a deep understanding of emerging technologies, its application, nefarious, benign, or otherwise, and the know-how of how to put the resources they have available to them where they may have an impact for the collective good. These leaders must enable applications of technology to flourish that consciously nurture and the future of culture and support society's growth. It's their responsibility to empower the co-creation of bottom-up, tech-driven innovation at a community level, a country level, and a global level. Okay, this is all fine, but in closing, how do we actually get to this point? Well, as I mentioned, much of my work nowadays is actually advising leaders and their teams on emerging technology and its possible impacts and use for strategic innovation within their field of work or influence. What I see through this work is that we need more authentic leaders to develop an awareness of these present futures that exist today, and the role that technology plays to manifest these different realities. We need more authentic leaders that seek out the weak signals of technology and understand the possible applications for good and bad. We need more authentic leaders that understand from their frame of influence what needs to be attended to, supplying resources to technology at the tipping points to provoke an appropriate response in society that nurtures a desirable future. We need more authentic leaders that incubate through the technology-driven solutions that we have to consciously co-create within their value chains. We're in the midst of a technology revolution, but with a very, very small r. Leadership has a pivotal role to play in this current act of society's development. And if I were to take this back to Richard's work, I've done a little thing here of trying to map back what I do to Richard's 5 literacies, and it might go something like this. I'm glad Richard's not present because he'd probably not agree. What I coach leaders on is that they've got broadly 5 areas that they really need to focus on within their own personal development, where they need to lead from a point of knowledge. One is that they need to get networked and wired into the intelligence of what is, and use technology to simplify the noise and the complexity, and to deliver relevant insights to the right tipping points within their field of influence at the right time. They need to make foresight real, leveraging things like predictive analytics to amplify the weak signals in their community or business, enabling possible futures that are already present to be identified and nurtured. They need to navigate growth through rapid iteration and incubation, prototyping and iterating technology that breathes life into that possible future that they choose to nurture. And step by step, they must embrace open innovation, recognizing that no one is as innovative as everyone, and that technology can enable the narrative that is the collective wisdom of the crowd. And finally, they must build resonance. They must demonstrate their values through how they use technology, how they support disruptive ideas through the smart use of technology, and how they incubate a virtuous cycle of values-aligned, tech-driven innovation. Technology and society are 2 sides of the same coin. Society would not exist without technology. Technology is propelled forward by society. With its newfound ability to have a global impact in real time, it's now up to all of us to be mindful of how technology is applied. And it is the responsibility of our leaders to become fluent with the tools of this new world, to work in harmony with technology, and to use the power it offers to create a future we desire. Thank you.
Something clever I need to do to make it work. Is that better? I'm at a time in my life where I think much better sitting down. Well, what a day we've been having, starting with that very stimulating presentation from Richard, but also having many glimpses into very different worlds, and that's one of the things that I've really had great pleasure in myself today, and that's getting those snapshots into a range of territories. And really that's caused me to reflect a bit on my own life. I'm 65 and I had my first serious management job when I was 28. So you don't need to do too much arithmetic to figure out that I have been directly interested one way or another in leadership for for over 40 years now. And that's a long time. And for the first 20, it was in the context of fairly senior executive roles in public enterprise and government. And then for another 15 years, I had my own, I wasn't serial, but I had my own consultancy practice, which was based on working with leaders and with teams who were grappling with things that mattered to them in a very big range of sectors. So some of that was in the corporate world, most of it was in the corporate world, but some of it was in government and a lot in local government and also in the third sector. And then 10 years ago, I came to Swinburne
and I'm an educator and researcher in the field of leadership. So in 35 years, as you can imagine, I'm scared of turning my head in case you can't hear me anymore, so maybe I'll just that a bit. In that time, I've heard a lot of people and a lot of stories about what it is that people are trying to accomplish from a leadership role or with the obligation to lead teams of other people. And that's 3 decades worth, it's 3.5 decades worth. And I was reflecting on what's changed in that time. And one of the things that has definitely changed in that time is that even though the stories are very different around what it is people are trying to accomplish through their leadership projects, over time, what I have noticed is that the language that they use to describe their experiences has become more and more homogenised, more and more thin, and less varied in terms of the vocabulary. Now, one might ask the question why, and I obviously do ask that question. One of the things that's happened, of course, in the last 30 or 40 years is that we have a much better educated population. We've had university education as a benchmark for what every adult or most adults could aspire to if they wish to have it. We've seen the rapid rise of what's called the modern organisation as a form, and we've seen the rise of universities and business schools. And it's in that context that I think you don't have to have an MBA in order to speak managerial speak. We've all bought into that language. And if I ever had any doubt of that, I'm very interested in sports commentary. I don't play any sport. I regard running for a tram as a major commitment. But I love to listen to people commentating about sport because it's exactly like listening to people commentate about the stock market. They've actually got no idea what's going to happen in the next half an hour, but they'd like you to think that they did. So they've invented a language and a discourse that enables them to deal with uncertainty. And if you want a discourse for uncertainty, listen to sports commentary. They're masters at it. They have to be. But one of the things that really came home to me not so many Saturdays ago was listening to somebody who plays for full forward somewhere in Australian rules football. And he was talking about a melee that had happened on the field, which is really a polite word for everybody starts hitting everybody else. And the interviewer said, so where's that all left you? And he said, we've got to stop it, He said, you can't have that sort of thing happening on television, on a football field now. It's not good for the brand. Now, this from a man, I'm saying what he said in a much more fluent way than he said it. He was really struggling for his words. 20 years ago, he'd have said it's not good for the club. It's not good for our value set as a sporting community. Now he says it's not good for the brand. Now, that will give you an idea of what I mean when I say that our language has become very homogenised. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a striking thing. So that also caused me to think about other things that I have noticed change, even in the time that I've been at Swinburne. When I started at Swinburne teaching into the MBA program, I was very lucky if I got 3 hours in the MBA program on leadership. Now, thanks to previous and current program directors, leadership is a very strong strand in the MBA, and we have a number of subjects. And what I have noticed is the extraordinary number of people from different disciplines who want to do those subjects as an elective. Now, I'd like to kid myself that that's because, I'm a fascinating teacher, etc., etc. It's not that. The reason that we get people from so many disciplines wanting to do something on leadership is because they recognise that it's part of what their education in a university needs to be about. So the room is full of very different people from very different disciplines. They're not all from the corporate world, but believe you me, they all understand the language of managerialism. It's because any organisation that you work for really increasingly insists that is the language. And to the extent that people in the third sector, and there have been a number of references to the third sector today, but very many people in the third sector are now writing in the management literature and saying we have lost our language to describe our own leadership dilemmas. We're actually losing that language because we've adopted corporate language. Now that's very interesting when you consider, for example, that a word like governance, which is a universal concern for a whole lot of different reasons, but the model of governance that you would learn about in the MBA bears little resemblance to the third sector's need for what you could call systemic governance, where your efforts are so interdependent on funders, volunteers, other agencies in your sector, that to think about governance as something that just happens within your own confined walls would be absurd. So it's a good example where a practice needs to be seen in context. But I also think the reverse is true, and it's forced me to think about two things that I want to share with you in the rest of the time that I have with you this afternoon. One of those things is to force me to think myself about once more with feeling, what do you think you're doing when you're helping people to lead? And it's more than, and it's different from, I believe, simply helping them with their own immediate leadership project. Important to them though that project might be, teaching them about leadership or educating or helping them, even if it's only 10% of how they learn about it, I think the burden has been on me to think about, well, what fundamentally do I think I'm doing in that room with them? I think I'm doing 3 or 4 things, and I only offer them as suggestions, but I think anybody in the room who is interested in the business of leadership education, I would recommend that you have your own version of these 3 or 4 dot points, because fundamentally it is not simply about helping people do the work of their organisation. It is something more fundamental again. I define leadership quite simply as the capacity to mobilise, focus, replenish, sustain, and sometimes withdraw energy from projects that matter to groups of people and that they couldn't do on their own. So once leadership is framed in terms of mobilising energy, and that's why I've called the book Energising Leadership, I think one starts to get a slightly different understanding around what it is that leadership work is actually about. It is about being able to pay attention, to the range of energies that are present and to what's actually happening to them. Are they being dampened? Are they being stimulated? Are they being angered? As I listened to your story, I was thinking about high levels of energy that were present, and it was amazing that you were able to keep your energy focused in the way that you did through that story. So that's how I've been thinking about energy, and that is a way of describing leadership, rather, that I think stands up in a range of disciplinary contexts. So that's one thing that I've been concerned about. The second thing, and it hooks a bit into what we were hearing earlier about EQ, that the work of leaders in mobilising and focusing energy, what you're really doing is encouraging people to put their attention in particular places. Now, I'm not a very good driver. I didn't learn to drive until I was 40, so you'll be relieved to hear I only keep to back streets. If you're driving in Melbourne, you're perfectly safe. But you steer a car where you're looking. That's what they teach you in advanced driving school. Not that I'm ever going to go to one. But you steer where you look. Now, all the neuroscientists who hook up your brain and watch what your brain's doing when you're thinking and when you're responding to things. So what you pay attention to over time is what you train your brain to pay attention to. So Goldman, in his latest book, talks about sculpting your brain, and basically says, if you only pay attention to a limited range of things, that's all you'll be able to see after a time. So any form of education, when you look at it from that point of view, is actually sculpting people's brain to pay attention to certain things. It's certainly the role of the leader to think about where do we want our attention to be, because that's where we're going to steer the car. So I'm very mindful now in all of my practice around this that I really pay attention to where I'm inviting people to put their attention. The other thing that I would, while we're talking about that, is to say that I think that leadership is a choice, and that nobody makes your leader except you, and that finally you make a choice as to how you will step up and invite other people to engage with you and to place their attention, given all the other things they could do with their energy and attention. So a person is making a choice as to lead, and sometimes they choose not to. I don't believe that leadership is necessarily something that we do for a lifetime or every hour of the day. I think leadership work is something we choose to do, and there are times, for whatever reason, we just don't do it. We might regret that later, but at the time that's what's happened. So cultivating the capacity to make good choices about when and how you try to get involved and in what sorts of ways, I think is my third obligation in those settings when I'm trying to be helpful to people in their leadership journey. The last thing that I wanted to do is to think, well, where does all the conversation that we've had today and the other conversations that we're often having leave us in terms of what education might look like? The universities have aided and abetted the rise of managerialism, and there's no doubt about that. And depending on, where you sit, that's a good thing, and it can at times, in the ways that I was describing earlier, I think be a bad thing, because I think one of the things that's happening is that we are losing the full range of literacies and languages through which to describe leadership. So in thinking about what universities might do in the future in this space, I think one of the things that we can think quite hard about is making sure that the literacies that we use and the languages that we use in discussing leadership reflect the diversity of the ways in which leadership is actually practiced. There is a great deal, for example, and we were having this conversation yesterday, thank you, David. One of the conversations that we might have is to think about how scientists do it. I mean, those people who got that machine on that rock yesterday or the day before, they sent that thing on its journey 10 years ago. But it was 10 years before that somebody actually conceived the project. And one of my colleagues reminded us when we were speaking yesterday, that's some vision, isn't it? 20 years worth of vision to lead and to focus and to keep a budget on track and to do all of those things. That is a wonderful piece of leadership coming from science. I'd love to have a conversation with scientists about how they lead. I would increasingly like to have conversations with IT people and project managers about how they lead, because we spent with the greatest respect, we spent 2 or 3 decades literally wasting a great deal of money on IT projects that failed for various reasons or overran or cost far too much money. And as an industry, to their credit, they've got their act together and they've said these things have to be managed better. Now, I don't know whether you've spoken with an IT person recently, but they've got a whole language to describe the leadership of projects. It's not a language I understand at all. I lose them after the second sentence. Nonetheless, it is all language about don't put all your eggs in one basket, manage your risks, know what your risks are, be able to come together at critical intervals. I used to think they were just using a Gantt chart. No, old hat. There's a whole language around leadership that can and needs to be tapped into that doesn't show up. I can tell you it does not show up in the journal articles of the American Academy of Management. There's no reason why it shouldn't. I could go on. I mean, leadership from the arts, I think, is something that we badly need. School principals use quite a different kind of language to describe leadership. Spiritual leadership, as we heard this morning, that beautiful prayer of Lunig's, comes straight from the heart of spiritual leadership. I think therefore, that we do need to think about those discourses a bit harder than we do at the moment in universities. I also think that we have not even begun to really leverage the multicultural learning community. And I still remember the joy. No, I suppose it was not joy. That sounds a bit vindictive. But I remember the stricken look on the faces of all the young men in an MBA class the first time they were confronted here in Australia with 3 feisty young women from South America who were taking no prisoners. It was just a discourse that they were totally unused to and took a whole semester before they could have a proper conversation. It was wonderful and a remarkable education. They got rather more from those 3 young women than they got from me for the whole 12 weeks. So that's another thing that I think that we can think a bit harder about. And the other thing is that in observing who's in the room with me now when I'm working in the leadership space at the university, we're very fortunate that we've got 4 or 5 quite different postgraduate master's programs. So we've got foresight people in the room, we've got entrepreneurs, we've got IT people, we've got all sorts of people in the room who come together to have profound conversations about what it means to lead. And I have learned so much from them in the last 5 to 10 years that I've been in that space, far more than I've given them. So I think that there are many pathways for us there if we choose to think about them. I would, just as a bottom line, I would hate it if we ended up with a homogenised leadership curriculum that spoke only one thin language about what is fundamentally a universal experience. Because unless you're living in a cave on a hillside with a group of villagers who are trained to bring you lunch every day in a basket, unless you're in that situation, you are going to be in the business of being led or leading. It's life. We're part of it. It's like parenting. It's a universal phenomenon. And I think that we need to be rather better educated around it than possibly we have been in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to the panelists. We will take questions, but before we do, I have been told to be the housekeeper for the day, something I don't normally do at home, but I'll do it here. When we do go out for afternoon tea, we will come back in here at 3:30. And then if you do have questions when you come forward, if you could just tell us your name and what your affiliation is, that would be wonderful. So let me entertain questions from the audience. I know it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. For the panelists. Yes.
Hello. Just want to find out from your perspective, how do we actually increase the number of people who understand IT and technology on decision-making roles? Because obviously part of the reason why a lot of projects go over budget is probably because the decision makers don't really understand how IT and technology actually works.
The reason why IT projects and technology projects tend to overrun is that we're still living in an outdated model of development which is tied back to the factories. We still believe that, whether it's waterfall down to agile, very badly executed within the corporate framework at this point in time. Budgets are set too early on, goals are set too early on, and we don't develop a form of flexibility or agility in our way of thinking that we would in life, and we don't do that within the corporation. And yeah, a lot of the work that I do is actually about re-education around that. There are many processes that entrepreneurs have adopted that are now finding their way into corporates. So the lean startup methodologies, the design thinking tools. You'll see the likes of even GE now starting to run their own programs based on those tools. Yet to see the results, but yeah, a lot of it is because we make decisions that we set our minds on too early on in the process. So it's not technology again. It's a lack of human behaviour.
I'd like to answer a little bit of that. Also, in my previous life at Northeastern, I was Director of Academic Technology. And you can see my whip marks in the back because I had to run interference between the techies and the academics. Some of that is to what Nita was saying. There is no common language between the technologists and other people, and there desperately needs to be that. A lot of what I ended up doing, and I'm going to guess what Dougal is doing, is we are translators.
Melissa Banks from Swinburne International. Maybe this is just something to throw back to the panel. I'm interested in this homogenisation of language concept, and particularly connecting that, Greg, to your comments about EQ and the demand for training and education by companies in training in EQ for leadership training. And if I can put in a plug for CQ, being cultural and intercultural intelligence, I'm just wondering whether you think that the homogenisation of the language around leadership and management, whether that perhaps is has depersonalised the whole leadership concept, and in whether that's now driving this need and demand for EQ training and education.
Look, we could talk all afternoon about that, apart from nodding as you and saying yes. I do think that. I'm just, I guess my concern about that is that when people need to negotiate uncertainty, which is what we were really hearing loud and clear from Richard and others through the day, if you've got a language that does not allow you to say, I don't know, you've actually got quite a problem. And I'm conscious, I've been an executive coach for 30 years, and I laughingly said to a colleague one day, I spend a lot of time teaching people to say I don't know in a sophisticated way that makes them sound like they're totally in control. Now, it's a sad thing when they've got to come to an executive coach to learn how to say, could there be another option here that we're not seeing, without feeling like a complete idiot? So the homogenation of I can't even say it now. What time is it? That's the problem about language. Language draws your attention to things, and if language does not make it possible for you to say, there has to be another way to do this, are we about to make the same mistake that we made before? If I'm limited to the corporate speak or the third sector speak or whatever speak it is I've got, potentially I've got a problem in that very space. And that's what I loved about the multicultural classroom, because people say, you know, what's that word you have in Indian for? And you get it. Yeah.
Great.
One of the problems, one of the big issues with IT projects is actually not the delivering the project. It's getting to people to actually work with the new technologies, and that's where organisations, that's the other big driver actually of change at the moment. We're getting a lot of work helping organisations adjust to disruptive change. Where the EQ comes in is actually in the skill set around supporting people through change. Because it's about having dialogue, it's about communication, and technologists, technical people are often not very skilled in that area. They don't communicate it well. And if you don't get people on board for change, you don't get the change. That's the big challenge. And there's just so many, I don't know, the project management people have the stats, that somewhere around about 60% of projects fail implementation test. And that's where EQ comes in, and that's why organisations are investing in it, because they want people who are more capable at enabling and working with others to negotiate and collaborate to bring about change. That's enlightened organisations, dare I say it. I'm saying there's a lot of currents in the waters of change, and some organisations are sort of putting in place competitive strategies. Dare I say government is sort of big in this sort of area. We get a lot of work from government in that area. But you don't tend to talk to your BHPs and so on about these things, about EQ as much. They just don't, that's not the emphasis. So there's organisations that have got a big drive, a big focus on the strategy, and and you know, they're implementing lean methodologies and all this sort of thing. That the companies that come to us want those sorts of companies want those sorts of skills. They're not looking for the enabling skills that really will make those sort of changes successful.
It's back here.
Hi, thank you. I'm a humble student at Swinburne University. My name's Daniel. I'm interested. You talk about the communication process, and I'm really interested. It was interesting to hear Rowan say that he was very open in communication with everyone on his team about what was going on. And you talk about the IT people, and generally, I know most entrepreneurs probably have the idea, but don't have the technology, and they say that's why Silicon Valley is so booming. Truck footballers as well. But as academics here, why is it that those people who are in IT, we do not teach them to communicate with others? As we are, or as a student, so I can't say we, but the teachers, why don't we teach IT people who have the technology skills not to be able to communicate with anyone else?
Okay. Before I turn this to the panel, is there anyone here who is in IT who would like to either run for cover or would... Okay.
No, I just wanted to say, because I actually did my undergraduate in engineering, and there is actually a subject on communication, but whether or not it was effective depends.
I love the fact that we say that it's the technologists that aren't the ones that are able to communicate. Because on both sides of that conversation, there's exactly that same question. And that's the reason why translators, as you've pointed out, do exist. And and as we go forward, those guys and girls that can join the dots between those different cultures and different ways of delivery, that's the reason why they'll become more and more valuable as we go forward.
Another piece to that question, and I know that I've got colleagues in this audience who completely agree with this, and clearly the people on the panel, is that we need to be much more interdisciplinary. What we tend to do is that you have your IT courses and then you have your communication courses. And so the IT people come to the communications courses hating it, whereas all you need to do is embed them. And if you embed the concepts into what the people want to take, they will learn it, as opposed to it being foisted upon them and look like something that they need to take, as opposed to, or have to take, or have to pay for, et cetera, et cetera. And we do a really rotten job of that as academics.
Oh, I agree.
Okay.
What can I say? Except
Was
yes.
a conversation stopper, if there ever was one. Any other questions? I know that, yes, in the back. Thank you.
I'm from Toyota Australia. I think people in this room might know that by the end of 2017, we will no longer have automotive manufacturing leadership. And I did my PhD with Swinburne. I finished in 2009. It's a great university. I maintain my loyalty and passion toward education. But my question is that while globally, there's so many academics are researching leadership, definition, purpose, and models, but I see a disconnection between the academic and the real world. And how do we actually make theory work? It's a real challenge. Mm-hmm. And nobody actually has tested any model or theory in the real world in a sustainable way. And that's my question to say, well, how do we address this issue if we agree it's an issue?
I'm happy to make a comment about that. I think in a lot of, look, if I can reflect on my own practice, I think the 70-20-10 applies to me, without any doubt. My most valuable leadership development experiences have come through experience, through trial and error. Where I've got good support and had good mentoring, it's been greatly valued. And I've done structured learning, postgraduate studies and so on. In fact, I'm doing some at the moment in leadership. And it's very rewarding to reflect on practice. My sense is the challenge for students is getting real experiences that they can build on. Now, academics are very good with case studies and stories and that sort of thing, but it's a fairly inadequate substitute for, you know, the experience of it and dealing with the experience and reflecting on your practice of trial and error and succeeding and failing. I don't know, Nita, what you're thinking about that?
Well, I'm mainly dealing with postgraduate students who are in employment and have got a leadership history. But I think what you're talking about is what I would regard as one of the great debates, where a whole community, a whole nation needs to find a voice in that conversation about what do we want our employment base to be, what is it as a nation that we want to be skilled in. While ever that's played out purely at a political level or purely at a corporate level, a lot of people aren't in the conversation, perhaps in ways that they need to be. And look, if a decision is taken to move a whole lot of stuff offshore, then there's still a conversation to be had in the community that's left as to, well, if it's not that, what is it? And to just simply say, well, those people find jobs somewhere else is poor consolation for people who've spent a lifetime in an industry. So there's a whole level of conversation that it seems to me doesn't happen. And I don't have a magic answer around how one does that, except that as a community we need to get a bit sharper about asking for answers or opportunities for engagement.
Thank you. We're keeping you from your afternoon. There's one more question. I'm sorry, one more question, and then I promise we will head out. And then please be back here at 3:30. The question is...
Hi.
Yes.
I'd just like to comment on what Greg said on the 70-20-10 rule and say my experience has been very, very different to that. I think I've appreciated much more a balance between the opportunity to formally reflect across disciplinary content about the way I have acted or will act, or the impact I've had on others or should have had on the influences maybe I should have, as Nita would say, sort of focused more on and been a little bit more sculpted about. So I think there is a healthy and dynamic tension there, which I think is much more balanced in relation to power. I think we've got to think about the issue of critical judgment and think about it in terms of notions such as power, stakeholders, the level to which particular environments encourage us to be critical, encourage us to sort of come forward with new perspectives, and I think we covered a lot of that this morning. So I think it's a constant dynamic, the sort of theory-practice sort of interface, but I suppose I was just reflecting that I see it very, very differently after having been around in the game of sort of both managing, leading and also the academic world for probably about the same time as Nita has. I just see it quite differently. So I suppose I was thinking when Greg was talking, well, if it is only a sort of 10% perspective in that you know, within sort of people considering how they perceive leadership and how they derive leadership experience, how about the sort of burgeoning of demand for formal education in that area? So there's a lot of sort of tensions in that I think, as Nita says, is a constant source of debate and probably will be for a long time down the track.
Okay. Just quickly, what I'm really saying is that's the broad or industry sort of focus at the moment, and that's how it's being seen in most of the larger organisations that we work with. But it's how you leverage that 10% really in an organisational learning context, and it's not across a lifetime. It's in learning that happens in the workplace, how much of that is actually through learning in a more formal, structured way. And not surprisingly, it's not as significant as what people do day to day. It's not. It's the important thing is the link. As a model, that's what stands. That's what organisations are valuing. And I think my sense is with the research on what's effective as learning, it's that your adaptive projects that give people real opportunity to apply things in the workplace that tends to have grip in work in terms of improving productivity and performance. So that's where that is coming from, rather than what the formal education has to offer.
So that, all right, it's quite. I'm getting the hook over here.
Okay, good.
My house cleaning obviously is not. It's not any better here than it is back home, but it's a great segue into what is going to be the final panel, where we are actually going to hear from the students who've been through leadership programs and be able to continue this dialogue about can you teach it, how do you teach it, and particularly in a multicultural environment. So come back at 3:30.
This has been a Swinburne production.